Okay.
The other night, I was in the car with someone to give me a ride home, and he turns to me and he says, seven tips. You need 7 tips for a successful Passover. I have 1 tip: go to a hotel. That's what he says to me. But I nevertheless will go through these 7 tips. I do thank the sponsors and Shem Shabbat Aliyah. We are grateful indeed. Thank you, Alan, for everything you do, down to the detail. Colorful, magnificent, original, funny, and always nice to have here everyone together for a positive evening. So thank you all, and again, special thanks to Alan. So here we're going to go. We're going to go ahead and provide you 7 tips. But when you go ahead and say that something is successful, you have to ask yourself, what defines a success? What's considered a success? You know, you could have an individual that perhaps is successful financially. We know very well there's more to that. You could have a person who is successful spiritually. So how do we define success? So I'm going to define success as keeping that proper balance. We have this magnificent holiday coming. Nevertheless, we have to be mindful of the fact that sometimes we could overwhelm ourselves at this holiday and cause at times damage, not just physically, perhaps even spiritually, when we do not balance things the way we should. So the 7 tips are for us to get through this period while we value our heritage and we stick to our traditions and we do things right, but at the same time we recognize that it is a time to be happy and not create an environment that people look at Passover the way you should be looking at Tisha B'Av, right? That's what we're trying to do. Now, so I have Tisha B'Av is easy, you say. Now, so here we go, my 7 tips, and I'm going to go through them. Tip number one, take Mechirat Chametz seriously. That's number 1. What do I mean by that? Take Mechirat Chametz seriously. So now, I have memories from my childhood in Mexico that it was in an afternoon, Erev Pesach in an afternoon. And there's a knock on the door, and I still remember the young man standing by the door with a document waiting to hand it to my father for the sale of chametz, and my father said to him, I just sold it, meaning you're late. Okay, now, Erev Pesach in the afternoon is not the time you do a Mechirat Chametz. Mechirat Chametz is done in the morning. So as I matured and I got a little bit older, things seemed quite confusing to me. Number 1, that a person expects to do the Mechirat late in the afternoon, and number 2, that my father said we just sold it. Later on I understood that year it was actually Erev Pesach that fell on a Shabbat. So you could do this sale on Friday the 13th, nothing wrong with that, right, our tradition. You could do the sale on Friday on the 13th, technically in the afternoon. So, but nevertheless it had an impact. The memories of Mechirat Chametz start for me at that moment on a Friday afternoon, as I know now, in Mexico City. Now, what do I mean by taking the Mechirat Chametz seriously? So, when I see a practice, when I see a tradition, I ask myself, what's the history behind it? When did it originate? Right? That's how I approach things. And when I start going through the sources, and I begin with Talmudic sources, and then I move on to the early period of the Rishonim, from the 11th through the 14th and 15th century, I realized that there was a development there. When it comes to the practice that we have chametz at home, we put it in a cupboard, we sell it, and then we buy it back after Pesach, that is relatively new. Meaning, in Talmudic times, the concept itself of selling actual chametz with an expectation to get it back only existed for individuals who were going on an extended boat journey. If you were going on a boat journey and the situation was such that you needed food and it's going to take 3 weeks and you are leaving a few days before Pesach, So you have a serious challenger, because on Pesach itself you can't eat the chametz, and you cannot own the chametz. So even if you want to eat chametz after Pesach, you have a challenge because you couldn't own it during Pesach. So therefore, the concept of selling the goods to someone with an expectation that they sell it back to you only was in play and only was practiced due to the fact that it was a necessity. And we have these statements that appear in the Tosefta, which is, again, a rabbinic text from Talmudic times, where we are told the person going on a journey, what you do is you go to the non-Jew, you hand him the chametz, you say it's yours, he pays a little bit for it, even though both parties know that after Pesach the goods are going to be bought back by the Jew. That is fine. That is what we are told. Now remember, in the circumstance described in this source, we are talking about goods that are movable, that there's a delivery. You lift them, you hand them over to the non-Jew, and it belongs to him. The Tosefta also tells us that in a situation that you're getting onto the boat and you see him buying goods, you have the option of telling him, you know what, if you are buying 20 pounds, buy 40 pounds, I'll buy it from you after Pesach. Also acceptable. Those were the circumstances where we find this idea of a mechirat chametz, and that was the mechirat chametz that was done into the 16th and 17th century. And then suddenly the Jew discovers the whiskey industry. And as you know, after whiskey, things look quite differently. And Jews indeed owned pubs, Jews were distillers, and the result was such that you had to find some solution for chametz where you are not able to actually deliver it. You cannot have 40 barrels handed over to the non-Jew with an expectation that he takes it home and then he turns around and sells it back to you after Pesach. That simply would not work. So therefore they came up with an idea of mechirat chametz that we are more familiar with, that indeed we sell it to the non-Jew. However, we are selling it to him and we are actually also leasing to him the location where the chametz is present, and there's a document and you hand him the key, so he owns the chametz. It is in his reshut, meaning it belongs to the non-Jew, but technically speaking, it is in the Jewish house. This is an idea that is mentioned early in the 17th century by a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yoel Sirkis, who recommends that that is an option that exists. It is interesting to note that in Prague, at that time, the rabbis were allowing the Jews who were involved in distillation and in the whiskey industry to go ahead and do that, but some old-timers who were previously involved in the beer business came to the rabbis with a big claim. When we were selling beer a few decades ago, you said that such a practice would be unacceptable. Now, with the whiskey, you suddenly became lenient. What changed? What's the difference between the beer and the whiskey? They asked the rabbis. When it came to the beer, we were merchants. We sold beer. And you would tell us that always before Pesach, we have to be sure to get rid of all of it. Sell it all. And even if you have to make a mass sale where all beer is 45% off or 50 or 60% off, you got to do it because you're not allowed to own the beer on Pesach. With beer, you didn't allow it. With whiskey, suddenly you give a green light. What changed, right? What's better? Is whiskey better than beer, they asked? What's the answer? What would you say? Yeah, whiskey is better than beer. So the rabbis had to deal with this question, and they explained that when it comes to the beer, the Jew would be purchasing the beer from others, from the non-Jews. So therefore, he could go ahead and calculate a few months beforehand how much to buy, like in many homes. When it comes to cereal, when you're buying cereal with family, with children, you start thinking a few weeks before Pesach already, how many more boxes, how many more packets of oatmeal will I need? That can be done with beer. The Jews who are distilling their own whiskey, that cannot be done. Anyway, if we would visit a community in the 17th and in the 18th century, we would indeed see a mechirat chametz, but it was not done communal. It was done by individuals. People would walk over to non-Jews and sell their chametz the way we do it today. That created problems because many people did not do it the proper way. Some people would just not walk over to the non-Jew and say, I'm selling you the key. And that obviously does not work. So therefore we find in the 19th century, meaning only about 170, 180 years ago, they introduced the idea of having the rabbi selling it. There were actually communities where the rabbi would buy it and then turn around and sell it to the non-Jew. In other communities, and this is the practice that we follow today, where we have an agent. Your rabbi is your agent. He's going to sell the chametz, and going to rent the location where the chametz is present, in some cases perhaps sell it. That is modern, 170, 180 years. Now, when I use the words, take mechirat chametz seriously, what I am saying is the following. Remember, the Torah prohibits you from owning chametz. We indeed rely on this idea that you could sell chametz and it's not yours. Treat it as not yours. In other words, have a designated location for your chametz. Spell it out in the document. If you are a doctor, please ask someone else to write the document where you can actually read the document. Because doctors have training. Sometimes you see kids with handwriting say this is a future doctor, right? But if you are indeed selling it, consider it a sale. Sell it, spell it out, mentally treat it like a sale. Treat it, it's not yours. And perhaps when you go ahead and you label a cupboard that was sold, don't write on it chametz. Write on it, sold, does not belong to me. When you walk by it on Pesach, treat it as an area that is simply not yours. And I believe that it is important to take that approach and not have a situation where you just cover some areas and the sale is viewed as some kind of religious act where you nevertheless view the goods as yours. Not the way to do it. See it as an actual sale. It's not yours. Have it in designated locations. It is ideal to even spell out in the document those locations. And that is my first recommendation. Tip number 1. Take mechirat chametz seriously. Utilize it as well, by the way. Areas that are difficult to clean. This is already the saintly Chafetz Chaim used to say, that a location that is difficult to clean and not going to be used during Pesach, just sell the location. Don't drive yourself crazy. Utilize it, right? It is something that works. Utilize it, but nevertheless take it seriously. And that was tip number 1. Tip number 2. Are you ready for number 2? Retain and contain minhagim. Retain, but contain the minhagim. And what do I mean by that? Minhagim are important. Minhagim are important. It is really the way we relate to the past, we relate to our community. Historically, minhagim were always communal. And to go ahead and ignore a communal minhag is not proper, because the fact is that this is what the community does, and just to stick out and have your own independence historically was problematic. Less so over the past 80 years, where we don't have historical communities, right? We are new here if you think about it. When you talk about communities in Europe that were around for centuries upon centuries, communities in Yemen that were there for thousands of years, and here suddenly we are in a new country, it is a little bit less so. But minhagim, we all agree, have an importance. However, they must be contained. Don't let them grow to areas they shouldn't on your clock. You have to retain but contain them. The perfect example we've studied here in great details and depth is the minhag of kitniot, right? We had a few chickpeas here today, and I hope you had some extra chickpeas. Ashkenazim at least should have extra chickpeas, because we're going to be missing them. At least I'm going to be missing them during Pesach itself. But if you analyze the history of kitniot, and when I use the word analyze the history, its first appearance, that there is such a custom of avoiding legumes, appears in the middle of the 13th century. Now you have to realize that for us Jews that is considered recent, right? Talmudic literature, there's no reference to it. It is considered recent, the 13th century. Now why on earth would rabbis make a decree, or why would there be such a practice developing where you avoid legumes? Different answers are given. Some note that people perhaps might confuse legumes and grain simply because they are processed similarly, they're cooked similarly. Sometimes they are stored together, which could create a problem as well. and this is actually true, that they would store their beans and grain. So therefore it was recommended not to cook legumes. And again, let me spell that out clearly. The minhag of kitniyot was not originally to avoid them, period, but not to cook them. Because just as you don't cook grain on Pesach, you should not be cooking the kitniyot. This is what we are told. Now, it's interesting that even in its early days, there was a rabbi, when the source for this minhag starts off in France. There's a Rabbi Yitzchak of Corbil, who we are told, he told people to avoid these legumes, but nevertheless, the great rabbi of Paris, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, said that this is absurd and he would eat his legumes. So you could tell that there were different schools at the time. One of the other rabbis notes that you should know, those that avoid legumes, it is because on Yom Tov we are supposed to be happy, and when you eat beans you're not happy. So therefore we avoid them. That's one of the earlier explanations given. However, by the 15th century, among Ashkenazi authorities, it became the norm. Great rabbis like the Maharil say to avoid it. It became the norm to avoid it, to such an extent that some rabbis even wondered, perhaps you have to even get rid of them from your house, like chametz. That is not practiced. Now, when you enter into the 19th century, you realize that there's a whole new debate. When they developed the ability to take a legume, right, to take a sesame seed, to go ahead and take a rapeseed, and extract from it the oils, when the item itself remains dry, that created a new question. In other words, the concept of vegetable oils exists already in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century. However, at that time, to extract the oils, they would cook the legumes and somehow distill or separate the oil from the water, and then they would have the oils. So obviously, if the legumes were cooked, it is something that there's a minhag to avoid. But when they developed a system towards the end of the 19th century to have a dry extraction, that created a new question. Perhaps there is no prohibition of kitniyot, meaning the prohibition should apply when you cook a legume, because if you would cook grain, there would be an issue of chametz. But if I can extract liquid from the legume without the legume coming in contact with water, there is no reason to prohibit it. And that's what the great rabbis of the second half of the 19th century believed, like Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, like the Maharshdam, and therefore it appeared at that time that the direction of things would be that vegetable oils would all be permissible. There would be no issue of kitniyot on oils. Now, what happened was, very interesting incident we discussed here in detail in the past, 1909, we got to visit the city of Yafo. And there's an amazing young rabbi there by the name of Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Cook. And Rav Cook was approached by a local individual who wants to produce sesame oil for Pesach. And he shows Rav Cook the equipment where they roast and toast the sesames, extract the oil. It does not come in contact with water. And Rav Cook gave an ashgacha, and he said this is kosher lePesach. However, when the old Yishuv in Yerushalayim heard about this, they went berserk, and they wrote him letters to back off such a heter, such a leniency. He did not. It created an issue. And these kind of issues of those who believe that you take a tradition, right, and you stick to it and you value it and perhaps you don't contain it, is something that we are a little bit more accustomed throughout the 20th century. It's interesting to note, by the way, that the great Rav Yaakov Emden, in the middle of the 18th century, was visiting the city of Mannheim in Germany for Pesach. At that time, there was a big debate among the scholars there in Mannheim regarding the status of potatoes, because there were those who believed that potatoes should be considered kitniyot. Why should potatoes be considered kitniyot? Because you make flour out of it, and if the original decree of kitniyot had to do with the fact that people might confuse legumes with grain, it should apply to potatoes. So therefore they wanted to prohibit potatoes, and Rabbi Milevsky said that I fought against the rabbi, and if the rabbi's there, and I did not allow them, and I had some backing from local community members, we prevented such a decree from taking place. Imagine a Pesach without potatoes. Can you just imagine that? Now, potatoes and eggs, right? That's the yom of cholesterol and starch. So now, it is always interesting to monitor. There are many, over the years, we've discussed many different items and how they became prohibited. You know, the bad luck that corn had. Why is corn kitniot, if you think about it? Meaning, many great authorities know that kitniot is not a prohibition, that is practiced due to reasons, but rather it is limited only to those items that were in existence when the prohibition came into play in the 13th and 14th century. For example, Ramosha Feinstein tells us that technically speaking, peanuts are not kitniot. That's what Ramosha Feinstein says. And he says, listen, if you have a minhag, respect your minhag. Don't walk into shul with peanuts, right? Even if no one's allergic to it. Don't walk into shul if indeed the community believes it's kitniot. But technically speaking, Ramosha Feinstein says peanuts are not kitniot. Why? So he says, this is a decree that this is a practice that developed at some point. The explanations given are to explain the practice, but they're not to define the practice. Meaning you don't take these concerns of, perhaps people are going to say that the beans are processed similarly to grain, so therefore avoid it. No, the prohibition applies to specifics. So it applies to the garbanzos, and it applies to lime beans, and it applies to black beans, those that were in existence in the 13th century. Items that they were not familiar with, says Ramosha Feinstein, are not included, period. So therefore, he said peanuts are technically permissible unless you know there is a minhag. So therefore, obviously, potatoes should not be included because in the 13th century, they did not have potatoes in Europe. And by the way, based on that, corn should not be included technically in kitniot because corn came from the Americas, from the New World. So why is it that corn became prohibited? So it's interesting to note that corn, even those who would allow the potatoes and the peanuts, it appears corn had some bad luck, it had a bad name. And what do I mean by that? How did they call corn in Europe? Turkish wheat. Any of the old timers remember? No. It was called Turkish wheat. Why Turkish wheat? Why Turkish wheat? What does corn have to do with Turkish wheat? Wheat, Turkish wheat. Now, why is corn called Turkish wheat? Turkish Weiss, or something like that in Yiddish. Reason being is, who are the merchants who brought those goods in the Mediterranean to communities? It was actually Turkish merchants, so it was known as the Turkish wheat. Now, if you call something wheat and you bring it into a community for Pesach, what are they going to say? Absolutely not. So that's really the reason, and this is something that Shlomo Kluger already tells us, that avoid the corn, because the corn, for sure, is called wheat, so let's avoid it. It's very, very interesting that if you think about corn and quinoa, they are exactly the same thing in some ways, meaning they're both from the New World. The difference is that corn was used in the northern part of the New World, quinoa was used in the southern part. I think if I look around this room among Ashkenazim, I would assume that we all avoid corn on Pesach, and I would assume that we all use quinoa on Pesach, right? Unless you don't use quinoa on Pesach, right? You never use quinoa because you don't like it. Why is it? Well, quinoa was never corn, was never labeled, right, Bolivian wheat, or Chilean wheat, or Peruvian wheat. That is something very interesting about the kitniot itself. I always like mentioning the fact that my grandfather in Uruguay asked the great Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank in Jerusalem about the status of peanut oil, and he told him that peanut oil is fine for Pesach. And there are two reasons to allow it. Reason number one is because it is peanut, and reason number two is because it is oil. And what do we mean by that? Peanuts, technically speaking, are not kitniot. Number two, oils, technically speaking, are not a problem because they are extracted dry. So you have two good reasons to allow peanut oil on Pesach. Nevertheless, and I'm sure some of you or many of us here do remember a time 30 years ago when you were able to find peanut oil under the OU. I don't know if you can still find it today. So there goes my message. It is important to go ahead and contain them, right? As you retain them. Retain and contain the minhagim. That is what we have, and that is number 2 on the list, okay? Now, yes, question, go ahead, why not?
Why sweet corn? I mean, sweet corn is also considered kitniyot. Why sweet corn is kitniyot?
Again, it is on all corn. The minhag became to avoid all corn. And corn was already in existence in European communities for a few centuries. Minhag was to avoid the corn. It became the minhag. That minhag is strong. We can't go ahead and... Okay, string beans are, I don't know if there's even a minhag that prohibited it. I don't know if I should say this or not, but the reality is that string beans should really not be a problem. Why? Because the whole idea of legumes, if you eat the beans, if you eat it with the pod itself, like string beans, right, that should not be considered even kitniyot, but I think the minhag is not like that, and I'm very respectful of the minhagim. Okay? I have to get to number 3. You're not leaving until you're all 7, okay? So let me make this clear. Number 3. Be sure that your cleaning does not turn into a dirty business. What do we mean by that? Now, I grew up with legends of great rabbis. Among the legends I grew up with as a child were legends about Rabbi Avram Yishaya Karelitz, the Chazon Ish, which we've heard of, a great scholar, a righteous man, a big tzaddik, a supernatural individual who passed away in late 1953, a family member. We've heard a lot about the Chazon Ish, and he was a righteous individual, very sensitive to the needs of Klal Yisrael. He himself had some very strict practices for himself. For example, on Pesach, he would sell or cover all his books, and he would only use a sefer on Pesach if he checked it page through page to be sure that there are no crumbs. Chazon Ish was concerned that every perur could be perhaps chametz, and the prohibition of owning chametz on Pesach applies even to the perurim. That was the Chazon Ish. However, the reality is that many other great authorities make it very clear that there's a concept called nullification on its own, meaning perurim, due to the fact that they are crumbs and they are insignificant, they are nullified on their own, and there is no need to really clean for them, and there is no need to check for them. So when you do a bdikat chametz, it is nice to sweep a carpet, but it is not a halachic requirement. It's a nice thing to have clean carpets. But the reality is that any crumb, and there probably are some crumbs in the carpet here, are nullified on their own because they are small, they were stepped on, they are dirty. That is not what cleaning for Pesach is. If you need a toothpick, you don't need to do it. That's the bottom line. To go ahead and clean with a toothpick has no halachic source. If you want to be stringent, go ahead, but don't destroy your holiday because of this stringency, right? That is something that is very important to remember. Do not allow, and teach this to others as well. Cleaning should not become the dirty business. You want to go ahead and do bdikat chametz properly. Check locations where you store food and be sure that there are no Cheerios or wafers. That is what bdikat chametz is about. Actual edible chametz. Crumbs are not the chametz we are seeking. They are nullified. Let's remember that, and it is an important piece of information, especially in a generation where people are inspired to do Pesach properly. Sometimes when you do it too much, it ruins the spirit. So please, tip number 3, do not allow the cleaning to become a dirty business. Okay? Number 4, we're moving along here. Okay? Now, in 1990, as you remember, we spent a Pesach in Thornhill. And we were by a specific rabbi's house with the family, and I think it was for the Seder itself, if I'm not mistaken. there was a glass there, a glass. The glass had lines, purchased in some Jewish store, probably quite expensive, and one line said on it, the measurement of Reb Chaim Naeh. The next line said the measurement of Reb Moshe Feinstein. And the top line said the measurement of the Chazon Ish. Now what exactly was that glass about? That was a glass to provide you the proper measurements to know how much to drink on the Seder night, right? Right? Maybe we should create glasses that say the right amount of whiskey, a little bit too much, and the top line should say you need assistance, right? Perhaps, yeah. With that, shiurim, measurements, how much do I drink? My father would love sharing with me this story. How Ner Israel Yeshiva on Finch would send out in the 60s these papers or laminated cards where they would be telling people how much to eat. And then one year they got an update, put it up, we need to increase the measurements. And they claimed that Ramosha has increased the measurements. That was the claim. And my father was not sure what to do. Right? Should the yeshiva go ahead and move on to the larger measurements or not? Luckily, there was a guest in town by the name of Rabbi Kamenetsky, and he turns to Rabbi Kamenetsky and he asks him, what exactly do I do? They're updating me with the latest measurements. And Rabbi Kamenetsky says, don't worry about it, tfos lishna rishona, which means, in Talmudic terms, work with the first approach. Don't worry about this latest development. So there's always this insight and interest and awareness about measurements. So what I'm going to tell you is to become familiar with them, but remember the following. Now, a lot of the discussions about measurements starts off with a concern of a very great rabbi in the 18th century. And what was the concern of this great rabbi? Now, for Pesach, if you want to know how to fulfill the great mitzvah of the night, and it is a great mitzvah, to eat matzah, and I call it a great mitzvah, because in the days of the temple, there were many times you could fulfill a Torah law mitzvah by eating something specific. If you're a Kohen and you eat truma, if you are in the temple and you eat some holy meat, there were many opportunities to fulfill this great mitzvahs by eating specific foods. Today, we do not have the opportunity. The only real Torah law mitzvah of eating a specific food applies to the Seder night, the first night. So that kizayit, that volume of an olive that you eat the Seder night, is indeed a very significant moment. And it's when you should be meditating at the time that it's indeed a privilege to do so. Now, to know the measurement of an olive, there are those who turn to Talmudic sources that tell us that it appears that you could determine the volume of an olive based on knowing the volume of an egg. Now, this was quite important for Jews in European communities that were quite far from the Mediterranean and did not have access to olives, or for sure not the fresh olives. And therefore, the egg was always used as a way of determining the proper volume of an olive. In other words, there were those who said, if you have an egg, a third of that would be the volume of the olive. There are those who say, some rabbis in France actually believed that the volume of an olive is half an egg. Now that's a little bit of a stringency, but nevertheless the egg was always used to guide us how much to eat. Now, the great Rabbi Cheskel Landau of Prague did some math, and after calculating based on his own personal measurements, he came to an interesting conclusion that eggs once upon a time were even larger. And as a result, there's been a discussion that perhaps the olive we should be eating for the Seder night is the volume of an egg. And to reach that, we have to work very, very hard. He worked through it. He had disciples who disagreed with him, and the general practice was not to follow him. However, in the 20th century, this opinion took off. And therefore, we find people that are sending out larger measurements, and you find in any magazine you pick up a whole series of measurements, and a lot of fascinating discussions about the topic itself. I like mentioning the following, that when you study the history of the last few decades of European Jewry, among the Torah scholars you will hear was a rabbi in the city of Baranovich by the name of Rab Elchanan Wasserman. He was one of the most powerful Roshei Yeshivot in that era, a disciple of the Chafetz Chaim. He was very, very strong, politically right-wing, and indeed a holy man who unfortunately was massacred by the Nazis in 1941 in Kovna. Now, Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman points out the following, that you should know that there's an old tradition that if the Torah tells you to eat an amount that is the volume of a specific fruit, you have to just eat that amount and do not concern yourself for adjustments that occur. If the Torah tells you eat the volume of an olive, so go to your local supermarket, pick up an olive, and if you have the volume of an olive, that is good enough. Meaning, the Torah shows specifically these types of items that were present 3,000 years ago and present today for you to fulfill the mitzvah with that amount. So basically what he is saying is to eat a kezait on the Seder night, find an olive, and if it is the volume of an olive, the mitzvah is fulfilled. No need for the measurement. It's quite fascinating. If you take the amount, if you take this approach, which by the way, there is no question that anyone that has difficulty should not take any more than that, right? You should not go ahead and take a person who has difficulty digesting or eating or chewing and tell them to eat anything more than the volume of an olive. The volume of an olive, and if you need, the shul could go ahead and supply olives, or we can tell you where to pick up olives in jars. They do exist. They sell them in every single supermarket. The volume of an olive is enough to fulfill the mitzvah. This is what we are being told. Larger amounts are an interesting history. So therefore, tip number 4 is become familiar when it comes to the drinking of the wine or the grape juice, right? I get into a little fight almost every year now with the kids because I make it very clear to them that our glasses are not going to be one tad more than 3 ounces. 3 ounces. And that's a little bit of a stringency, right? Because technically speaking, the revi'it that you should be drinking to fulfill the mitzvah, technically speaking, 2.6 ounces would really be enough. I'm a little bit more lenient because these children enjoy their wine. Navgal likes your sparkling grape juice that you're going to have. But 3 ounces is the amount. No need for more than that, period. And you'll hear discussions and you'll read in publications. You could become familiar with it, but you can nevertheless believe me and trust me that this is the amount that you could consume and fulfill the mitzvah. So we already got through 4 tips. Okay, are we ready for, how are we doing with time, by the way? We're okay. Tip number 5. You know that many Sidurim have printed for Shabbos Haggadah to say the Haggadah. Are you familiar with that practice? Any of you have that practice of reading the Haggadah and Shabbos Haggadah? The old timers. Not that you're old. I'm just saying, let me try it again. People who hold on to old traditions read the Haggadah. Okay? And this is a very old Ashkenazi tradition. We in my family, we don't have that tradition because the Gaon of Vilna notes that in the Haggadah we say, Yachol Rosh Chodesh, you might think that there's a mitzvah to start Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim from Rosh Chodesh. The Torah tells us, no, you have to have in front of you the Pesach, the Matzah, the Moreh, and only then there's a mitzvah. So according to the Gaon of Vilna, you don't do it. And we have a list in our family, a few Gaon of Vilna practices that we're very proud of. Like we only bench until Aliyah Chasrenu. You know the benching? Aliyah Chasrenu, for many of you, it's probably the middle of benching. For our family, it's the end of benching, because that was the Gaon of Vilna's practice. And so too, we don't say on Shabbat HaGadol. Now, it is very possible that this practice of reading the Haggadah on Shabbos HaGadol was more due to the fact that Shabbat afternoon is a time when we can sit and study. And you want to become familiar with the Haggadah. You're going to be reading this text. You want to know what it's about. So the proper time to prepare is Shabbos afternoon. Right? We have a drasha, we have a learning session. But it is the idea of preparing for the Seder. And therefore, tip number 5 would be study the Haggadah before Pesach. Remember, this is a very significant evening. You are transmitting to the next generation. It is an evening that I can tell you, and I'm sure that many people in this room could share with you memories from their childhood from the Seder. You are transmitting, so be prepared. If it's significant, be prepared, right? You have an event, you have something you're going to do that's important, you prepare for it, become familiar, have some insight, know what you're going to share, know what you're going to think. That is how you answer, and this is indeed a tip. Tip number 5, prepare by studying the Haggadah before Pesach. That's number 5. Now, tip number 6. And tip number 6 is you can benefit from the fact that I am your rabbi and you could become a Talmud. Let me repeat that. You could benefit or you could become a Talmud. And let me explain what I'm talking about. Now, I've shared with you several times that my grandfather, my father's father, he grew up in Lithuania. He was ill during World War I. Recovered after the war, after he lost his mother. He was 13 at the time. But he was sent to a yeshiva. He was sent to a yeshiva in a city called Grodno. And eventually he was sent to a suburb of Kovna, the suburb of Slobodka. And he excelled there. And it was a place where he studied a lot. He became recognized as a scholar. And in 1924, he had the privilege of being chosen as one of the 6 students sent to the land of Israel to establish a yeshiva in the city of Hebron. And my grandfather was there from 1924 to 1929. Now, I got to know my grandfather many decades later. But what I do remember as a young child is that we would come to a Seder in Yerushalayim and we would look at the matzos, and the matzos were always square for the Seder. Let me repeat that. Seder night, we all eat shmura. Most of you, I would assume in this room, eat round hand shmura. By my grandfather, it was square shmura, which is more common in Israel, but I was always fascinated when he picked it up. And I assume that historically, due to the fact that he was in Israel in the 1920s, at that time, there were 2 communities, basically, among the Ashkenazim, the Hasidic and the non-Hasidim. Hasidim were very careful to always use hand, because that's the way it was done in the Altaheim. You want to be traditional. Among the Lithuanian Jews, they focused more on what is practical and what is best halachically. And their assessment was, at the beginning of the 20th century, that hand matzah could have some problems, and therefore they actually worked in Yerushalayim with a machine shmura. There was a great rabbi, a disciple of Rabbi Yisrael Salant, Rabbi Naftali Amsterdam, who wrote in the early 20th century that here in Yerushalayim, I myself use the machine shmura. My feeling is that my grandfather adopted that practice at that time, and therefore when I remember his story from the early 1980s with the square machine matzah, it is due to what he picked up in the 1920s, and that is the practice that I have at our Seder. We do not have hand shmura. There are times that there are guests that would come and they would bring their hand shmura, and I have a designated area to keep it away from my holy machine matzahs. Now, with that, if someone would ask me, what should I do? So I would say, listen, in general, follow your minhag. At the same time, if for whatever reason there is convenience in having or adjusting or switching to machine shmura, and there are some very good machine shmuras, by the way, standard-wise and quality-wise, I would give you a green light. Even though I don't believe in changing minhagim, quote-unquote, the reality is that if you ask me, right, you could become like a Talmud, and I would give you a green light. So this is it. This is the tip number 6. If indeed there is a need, you could ask me, and just as my grandfather switched at some point, and all great rabbis who allowed the machine shmura switched, because Moshe Rabbeinu, with all due respect, was for sure using a hand shmura, and so too was Rashi, and so too was the Ramah, and so too was the Gaon of Vilna. But due to the fact that technology gave, God gave the wisdom, and God gave the ability to create these matzos with the machine, which are on a very high standard, at some point someone switched, and if I do it, and you ask, I can actually give you that heter. So this is a benefit, this is a tip. You can benefit from the fact that you are a Talmud. So, we're going to review the six first tips. Take mechirat chametz seriously. Retain and contain minhagim. Don't allow cleaning to become a dirty business. Become familiar with the shiurim. Study the Haggadah, please. And number 6 is you can benefit from the fact that you are a Talmud. The last tip is v'samachta b'chagecha. Right? I was blessed. I always felt that there's excitement at home. And I've shared here the story of my father, how after the Seder one year, we asked him the Shaila if we could go ahead and have some Coke. At the time there was a Pesach, the Coke. At the time I used to enjoy drinking Coca-Cola when I was young. And the Shaila was, after the Seder, we all know that we're supposed to retain the flavor of the matzah in our mouth. So the question was, yes, we're not going to go ahead and eat some chocolate mousse, but the question is, would Coca-Cola be permissible? I asked my father the question, and he didn't answer. And he said, you know what, if you want to know, let's go through the sources. And after the Seder, this was already after midnight, we sat there and we took out the books and we went through the sources, and my father guided myself and my brother in the proper direction, where we got a leniency to drink the Coke after Chatzos. The excitement of going through the text and walking away with something practical was a real simcha at the time. Everyone has their own area of Jewish tradition that brings excitement. It could be the song, it could be the environment, it could be the foods, it could be the study, it could be the stories. Whatever it is, make happiness part of your Yom Tov. And the idea of this talk and the idea of this gathering, of this lecture is, yes, these are tips to keep it balanced. These are tips to keep it successful. Let's stick to our tradition. Let's value them. Let's view them as a gift. Let's be sure that we transmit them to the future. But at the same time, do it where we have a v'samachta b'chagecha, and it's an opportunity to wish everyone here a Chag Kasher v'Sameach, a meaningful Pesach and a good one. And thank you again for coming, and thank you to our sponsors, and thank you for Alan. Erev Tov to all.
The crumbs have just been cut.
So, do benching?
No.
Yeah.